Good evening and welcome. I'm Dr. Christopher Schulte, Endowed Associate Professor of Art Education at the University of Arkansas and the founder and director of the Center for the Study of Childhood Art. I'm joined this evening by my dear colleague and co-host, Dr. Hayon, Associate Director of the Center for the Study of Childhood Art and Assistant Professor of Art Education at George Mason University. Thank you for joining us this evening. On behalf of the Center for the Study of Childhood Art and the Art Education Program at the University of Arkansas, I'd like to welcome everyone to this evening's event, the first of 4 exciting events scheduled for this year's Childhood Art Speaker Series. Before we begin, though, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the indigenous history of the land that the University of Arkansas campus sits on, ancestral lands which indigenous peoples were forced to leave, including the Osage, Caddo, and Quapaw nations with ties to Northwest Arkansas. I'd like to further recognize that a portion of the Trail of Tears runs through our campus, and that the Cherokee, Choctaw, Muskogee, and Chickasaw and Seminole nations passed through what is now Arkansas during this forced removal. The Center for the Study of Childhood Art acknowledges all indigenous teachers, researchers, and all other residents in our community and region today. Featuring the work of leading scholar practitioners, the Childhood Art Speaker Series is dedicated to testing the pliability of how we think about and approach the study of childhood art. While many speakers scheduled to participate in this series present on topics and issues which clearly and directly relate to the artistic, play-based, and aesthetic practices of children, which is to say that the connections to childhood art are perhaps more explicit, there will also be speakers whose practices and presentations live adjacently to this work, yet at the same time generates the potential necessary to articulate new, different, unsettling, and inspiring lines of inquiry. Our hope is that this balance contributes to a more equitable and inclusive engagement with childhood art and its relations to historical and contemporary childhoods. To learn more about our work and current initiatives, please take some time to visit our website at www.centerforthestudyofchildhoodart.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at CSCA_childart and on Instagram at UARC_Center for Child Art. Additionally, this event is being recorded and will be posted on our website at a later date. The recording is also scheduled to be available on our YouTube channel. During tonight's presentation, we ask that you use the chat and/or Q&A function to submit questions. While we will not have time to answer all of your questions, we do plan to hold space and time for some questions to be addressed at the end of the presentation. And now, Dr. Park will introduce our distinguished speakers. Again, thank you for joining us.
Dr. Tran Templeton is an assistant professor of early childhood studies at the University of North Texas. Tran studies how children construct their own identities through photography and their day-to-day aesthetic practices. She also thinks and writes about how adults would better see children if they stop to listen and look at what children do in and with the world. Tran has published in journals like Children's Geographies, Harvard Educational Review, and Bank Street Occasional Papers. Dr. Vivek Vellanki is a visiting assistant professor in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction and a postdoctoral fellow in the Center for Research on Race and Ethnicity in Society at Indiana University. Vivek earned his PhD in Curriculum Instruction and Teacher Education from Michigan State University. His scholarly and artistic works center issues of migration, transnationalism, and youth identity and culture. He draws on visual methodologies in research creation in order to question the boundaries between scholarly and creative work. He has worked with teachers and youth in India and in the United States in exploring the role of the arts in education and the possibilities for envisioning the classroom as a site for exploration, play, and imagining socially just features. Dr. Templeton and Dr. Vellanki, on behalf of the Center for the Study of Childhood Art, welcome to this Childhood Art Speaker Series.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Schulte and Dr. Park. We're so grateful for the both of you and thankful for the Center for the Study of Childhood Art for this invitation to be part of this amazing inaugural speaker series. So we're excited to talk with you all tonight in the audience about children's photographs and drawings of their local places. Before we get into the talk, I'm going to hand it off to my partner, Vivek, who will lead us in the provocation.
Can you all see the screen? And can you hear me okay? Thank you, Tran, and thank you once again to CSCA, Dr. Schulte and Dr. Park for this invitation. We're both excited, Tran and I, to be here and to share this time with you, but we wanted to start by inviting you to make. So if you can please find a piece of paper or use a digital app that you can use to draw or mark. We want to start first by asking you to draw a map of your neighborhood. If possible, restrict yourself to using one color. Use about 80% of the paper to do this, or the surface on which you're making this drawing or marking. We'll be adding some elements, so you might want to expand it. That's why I'm asking you to restrict to 80% of the paper at this point. We'll take about 5 minutes to do this. We'll play some music in the background and let you know when you're 30 seconds to time. Great, thank you for doing that. Now we want you to use another color, and we would like you to draw or mark your favorite places to eat in the neighborhood. We want you to think of these places expansively. So it might be a restaurant, but it also might be a neighbor's home. It could be a religious place of worship or a friend's house, or sometimes you just like to sit in your car and eat. Whatever that place is for you, find a way to mark it or draw it on the map. We'll take 2 minutes to do this. And again, I'll give you a warning when we have 30 seconds left. And finally, using a third color, we'd love for you to draw or mark your favorite places to play. Once again, we want you to think of these places and play expansively. It might be a park near your house. It might be your living room, a pole outside that you like to swing on, a tree you like to climb. Whatever that place of play is for you, please mark that on the map. And we'll take 2 minutes to do this.
Hey, great. Thank you all for making with us. We'd love for some of you to share what you've created if you're willing. We have time for two or three people to share. If you're willing, please use the hand raise function. You can find it at the bottom of your Zoom screen, possibly in the More tab if you can't see it right now. If you can't find it, go ahead and put a request in the Q&A. And Dr. Schulte and Dr. Park will help us with allowing you to activate your camera.
Yes, I am one of the panelists. So when you asked to us draw neighborhood, I wrote in really small, like I didn't think of the city all the time. I just think my street and my apartment complex. So when you asked the second time, hey, draw somewhere like your favorite, I was like, I didn't know that, but I tried. So I wonder if you could see it. I should use that too. Can you see it?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, I try to use one color to see my neighborhood, my apartment complex, and that was the green color, because there are a lot of trees and parks around my neighborhood. So when you ask the second time, where is your favorite place? So this is my bike. I ride my bike. So I use the red color. And also there are like some bench that I sit. It is right in front of my apartment. So in the third question, because I didn't have too much space and I didn't think of like as a whole town. So I draw another table in the same park. So I go to play actually with my neighbors' children, kids, because I like to play with them. And there is my cat. And we play here and this area, and I use the blue color for that.
That is lovely. Thank you so much. And I saw that on that little picnic table, you had a plate with some food on it. Did I see that right?
No, it's not food. There's a like hole in the table. So I try to draw it. I don't know why, but yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much for doing that and sharing.
Thank you.
That's amazing that your bikes and your cat made it in there.
I'm a big fan of the cat on there too. Thank you. Is Mila, are you able to join us?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, everyone. All right, so my drawing skills are terrible. So I start with that. And let's see. Can you see something? Okay,
Yes,
so, all right. I started with the first color was brown, and I drew my landlord's house because I live in their property. And then this one is kind of the neighborhood where I have the Secretary of State, where I went to get my ID, so very close to my house. Lots of trees. So, and these are apple trees. So I try to draw apple trees. So everything with brown was my first color. And then the second part of the assignment, you ask, where do I like to eat? Actually at my landlord's house. So I even put Chef Ruth and Ange with 5 stars for the food and a red heart. And there is this bay shore. So the third part of the assignment, where do I like to play? So very close, I just have to cross the streets and I'm at the bay. And I like to go to this bay shore and walk and kind of relax a little bit. So I don't know if you got a sense of what's
beautiful.
going on in my little neighborhood. So here it is. And then there's lots of, everyone has like a pickup truck. So I drew one pickup truck, but pretty much everyone in this area drives a pickup truck. So I wanted to claim that as well in my drawing. So here it is. And then the name of my little town, Lens, and then the Bay Shore in Lens.
I might have missed it, but are those trees, do they have fruit in them or?
Yes, apples. These are apple trees. So the little the little balls representing apples.
That looks like an ideal place to live, quite honestly. Thank you for sharing with us. We do have time for Fiorella to share. You might need to unmute.
Hi, how are you?
Good, you.
So this is my drawing.
Yeah.
Hold on, it's this way. So this is, I live in apartments building, so there's 2 towers. The pool. And then what does this say? The playground. My favorite Thai place.
Oh, yeah.
There's another restaurant, I don't know the name, so I never been inside, so I just put restaurant. The train tracks, going to Chicago and going to Elmore. For play, there is the sidewalk where my daughter rides her scooter, the pool, and then the prairie path where we go for walks.
Oh, lovely. I ask you, so you said that you've never been inside the restaurant, but what made you mark that restaurant?
Well, the initial prompt say like neighborhood, so I was just thinking, neighborhood. I know there is a hair place here, but I didn't really never been inside either, but I've been to the Thai place many times, so I made the little umbrellas.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you.
And I think Thea, maybe, I'm not sure if Thea was going to share or not, but I think that's the time that we have for now. So thank you, Vivek, for facilitating that provocation. And thanks to everyone for engaging in it with us. We love seeing those maps. If you're not able to share with us this evening, we do hope to hear from you in some other way. If you'd like to share your maps with us and with the center, we're going to share a link with you at the end of the presentation, as well as some information about some books that we'd like to give away. So before we get into our work, we wish to thank the children and pre-service teachers who participated in both of our studies that you'll see here. You'll see their play and their work throughout our slides alongside the photos and images of other photographers and researchers. We also want to mention that a version of this paper will be published in the journal Language Arts in March of 2022. For those who might find it helpful tonight, I'm going to just quickly put the script of this talk into the chat. There is a list of references as well there in case you need that. So I'm going to do that right now. I can get to this. Yep. So there it is. So we just ask that you only use it during this time, during the presentation, obviously not distribute the link. Okay. So we wanted to start out with a quote by the photographer Teju Cole as a provocation in and of itself. Teju Cole writes, we think we are moving through the world, while the whole time the world is pulling us along, telling us where to walk, where to stop, where to take a photo. So let's consider, where did you proverbially stop in your map making just now? Why were those the places that you marked? What importance do they have to you, if any at all? Are they landmarks that you've determined for yourself, or were they determined for you? Cole forces us to think about the nature of how and where we move in the world, what compels us to stop and pay attention. The quote itself comes from an article that Cole penned entitled "Take a Photo Here" for his New York Times On Photography column. In it, he explores the ways that complex spaces can often be photographed in the same ways time and time again by mainstream photographers, visiting tourists, and longtime residents of a city or town. The photographs here, for example, were taken of the stairs at the New Museum in New York by different Instagram users. If we zoom out, we might also consider what a person who has never been to New York City imagines based on mainstream photographs: an LED lit Times Square, the emblematic frontal view of the Statue of Liberty, skyscraper crowded blocks, the harried movements of yellow cabs. Instagram feeds, Flickr, National Geographic, Life magazine, these spaces circulate the images in our everyday lives, and they have a common visual language that communicates an aesthetic dimension. These repetitions and reproductions of images come to define place as they train us in how to look, where to look, and what's worthy of looking at. The acts of creating, viewing, and circulating images informs our notions of particular places. Simultaneously, details like who's using the camera, how, and for what purposes matter to stories of place. That is, conceptions of place are produced in and through dominant lenses and colonial ways of seeing. Yet rarely do our visualizations and understandings of place draw upon children's experiences of their local environments. Gillian Rose notes that, quote, specific visions of place both draw on and reproduce ideas that are grounded in social power relations. Consider, for example, that National Geographic has built its entire reputation on visions of places and people based on capturing the other with a camera lens.
Dominant adult conceived images of place can also elide the complexities of everyday life for children. While iconic photographs of New York City as one example of place predominate, photographers like Helen Levitt and Andrew D. Wagner redirect our attention to the perspectives of young people living and learning within specific places in the city. Helen Levitt, who took New York street photographs, made children the protagonist of the city through pictures of their playful activities in several series in the 1930s and the 40s. In Here for the Ride, the photographer Andrew D. Wagner depicts the subway as a site of social formation for New York City youth. While adults, we might think about playgrounds and after-school clubs as places most identifiable with children and youth, Wagner focuses on the subway as a significant place for young people. Kids have so much agency in the subway. They have their own community in a way, he notes in a Paris Review article. These photographic series remake the city and our perspectives of it. Rather than portraying New York City as an exemplar of urban renewal and capitalist superiority, ideas that are important to many adults, Levitt's and Wagner's series force a different set of questions. To children, what is a place? What are children's renderings of the places they inhabit? We've titled this talk, What is this place? Children's art as provocations for placemaking, because Tran and I are interested in questions of place. What is place as conceptualized by children through their image-making practices? As visual scholars of childhood and youth, we understand that children make photographs and drawings that reflect what Somerville refers to as their embodied connections to and movements within their local environments. In this talk, Tran will discuss photographs taken by 2 to 5-year-olds across an image-based study. We position the photographs that children make as part of their aesthetic engagements with the world, provocations that decenter our adult ways of seeing the local areas we traverse. The children's pictures create what Hackett and Somerville call new versions of place, and make an argument for my work with prospective teachers on image-making practices that reorient them to their localities and map making. Before we discuss our work with young children and with prospective teachers, we want to first think about the constitution of place. How are places read and understood? How do they become storied? And how can visual methods give us insight into non-dominant readings of shared spaces?
Places are read and understood in multiple ways by its different inhabitants. That is, places are not simply physical locations, but rather sites wherein the different inhabitants make their own meanings, and their meanings are distributed, multiple, and produced within and through particular arrangements of human and more than human relations. Vernon Deligny, for example, mapped what he referred to as the wander lines of autistic children's and youth's movements, gestures, and trajectories as they live together within an autistic commune. Emphasizing the network as a mode of being, Deligny and fellow adults whose roles were to take the lead of the autistic inhabitants traced the movements of children. They made note of the children's daily rhythms, their moments of interaction with sheep, the sound of sheep bells, the motion of an axe that chops down trees. Take as another example the case of school as a shared place. A school is both a specific local place and a metaphysical imaginary, according to Somerville, wherein knowledge is constructed from the vantage points of its inhabitants, human and otherwise. Each student, staff, and faculty member calls up different stories, discourses, and affects about the place of school, whether it be physically within the building, in virtual spaces, or relationships that flow out of the school buildings. Similarly, the classroom pets and plants, library books, gym equipment, and food waste tell their own stories. They map out different and sometimes overlapping organizations of relations within the same spaces. The human and more than human subjects separately and together produce different and new mappings of familiar spaces. We take up Fikile Numalo and Jessica Rubin's conception of more than human place literacies, which works to dislodge humans from their self-determined position as the principal protagonist within the story of place and within literacy as it's commonly understood as a social practice. Rather than conceiving of literacy and aesthetics as a human-oriented and human-organized activity that benefits other humans, Numalo and Rubin note that viewing literacy as more than human, quote, unsettles the centrality of humans as subjects whose intelligence and agency enables their sole consumption and production of meaningful messages. Encouraged by Numalo and Rubin, we attend to children's encounters with place, instead of necessarily how children read or even make meaning of place. In Numalo and Rubin's words, literacy learning emerges through children's co-constituted relations with elements of local place ecologies. John Wargo adds that young children's practices are deeply engaged with the material, imaginative, and more than human aspects of their surroundings. For example, Iris, a participant in Wargo's study with 6 to 8-year-olds, used a GoPro in her body to explore the space from the perspective of an ant. Moving closer to the earth, she screeched,
I'm an ant. Look, I can hold my body close to the ground. I'm seeing the ground as an ant would. This is the perspective of an ant.
The children in Wargo's research show us that rather than thinking of learning as a product or as a means to an end, the focus is on what Candace Kuby refers to as, quote, the interactions of people and materials, movements, and surprises that are diffracted through moments of creation and contact.
To better but not fully grasp what Numalo and Rubin refer to as more than human play stories, we use visual methods, specifically children and pre-service teachers' photography as a tool for noticing the layers of children's play stories that do not necessarily privilege humans as primary to the story of their world. Children's photographs, Templeton argues, are outward facing. That is, the pictures they make proclaim their position within worlds, while photographs that adults take of children position them almost as though children are placeless. We're drawn to child-made images because they bring place, materials, and more than human worlds into sharp focus. Young children are placemakers and knowledge producers who have unique perspectives of their local places. Alison Clark, who introduced the mosaic approach wherein very young children make and narrate photographs, has long advocated for environmental design that accounts for children's perspectives of their schools and play areas. Nolas and Varvantakis' Children's Photography Archive 2 provides salient examples of how place matters in children's lives. The photos made by children in Athens, Greece, Hyderabad, India, like the one you see on your screen right now, and London, England, depict for all of us what a childhood gaze might look like and how children shape their worlds through the many ways in which they represent those worlds. These scholars recognize that the camera is an important tool to accessing different children's perspectives. The role of photography in the field of art education is fraught with varying tensions. Its perceived position as an artistic endeavor, limited opportunities for students to explore this artistic practice within schools, among several other issues. However, scholars have brought attention to how children's photography is an important aesthetic engagement with the world. Sacker and Kusikova write, a child's initial experiments with photography are no longer seen as deficient acts of representation, but an active construction of the here and now. Unfortunately, adult readings of children's photography are steeped in issues facing the field of art education at large. The crux of this tension lies in what adults and teachers try to define as meaningful in children's art, and that which, according to Schulte, remains wild or is subjected to discourses that make it wild. Children's photography, much like children's art making practices, is often perceived by adults as a practice in the making. Adults are often too quick to describe children's photographs as an inchoate practice that is recapitulating in some predetermined way the development of the field itself. This kind of description is common for children's aesthetic engagements, whether that's drawing or photography. Adults who are intervening in children's photography practices can often be heard saying, this image is too blurry, why are you so up close to the subject, you should frame this using the law of 2/3, etc. Tran and I dislike these kinds of adults, even though sometimes we catch ourselves being those adults. In our work, we see children's photographic work as an aesthetic engagement that offers generative and provocative ways to see the world anew. We join scholars like Hayon who view children's aesthetic engagements as tied to their everyday activity and experience of and with the world, rather than an obsession with the product of art. We want to share now the more than human play stories of photographs in trans research with very young children's image making.
The setting and time of this play story is New York City circa 2016, when I collaborated with 11 2 to 5-year-olds across 10 weeks to understand their photographic practices and presentations of self through images and corresponding narratives told verbally and extraverbally. Children in one preschool classroom at a university-affiliated childcare center took turns with the digital camera to document the world, their worlds as they saw fit. During a group meeting with the children, I gave them a prompt to take pictures with the rationale that I was interested in how children make images. The children took up this provocation on their own terms, each taking home a shared Kodak Pix Pro camera to produce however many images they wished to. Some children made as little as 11 images, while others made as many as 157. From there, I adapted Wendy Luttrell's collaborative seeing approach to move through multiple phases of research that provide children with multiple opportunities to speak to their photographs. These phases illustrate how children's relationships with the content and narratives of images can change according to when and where images are viewed, in addition to with whom the photos are viewed. After image making, each child who consented engaged in a one-on-one auto-driven photo elicitation interview, at the end of which the child selected several favorite, quote-unquote, favorite photos. During a child-led group meeting, the photographer shared those preferred images with classmates, fielding questions and their classmates' multiple interpretations. Finally, the children's photos were edited for displays in photo books by them. These photo books were often pulled off the shelves as children read the image to themselves or one another. At the bottom right there, you can see a small group of preschoolers gathered in a practice of looking together at one of Kyle's photos. For sure, all of the 633 photographs made by the 11 children in this study took place somewhere, whether in homes, in the classroom, or in transition between school and home. While a great number of photos depicted classroom life, many of these seem to be test shots for the children, as only 3 of the 60 preferred photos that were selected to be shared took place within the classroom. The children together made 181 images of public spaces, street corners, sidewalks, parking lots, subway platforms, for example. And these places were marked in images with other children and families, but also the many dogs that share New York City walkways, sidewalk planted trees, fencing and gates that denote places for play and rest, for example. These were not photographs of purposeful destinations, at least on adult terms, but oftentimes were presentations of liminal spaces. Unlike adult-made photographs of New York City, they were not repetitive. Each child had their own rendition of their movements through the city with shared concepts, of course. Jalen, age 3.5, for example, documented his trek from school to home. The photos depict his crowded subway ride as shown on this slide, his views of other children and floor displays of soda and bread in a local bodega, pauses to capture the view, and sidewalks lined with garbage and recycling bags. While he included shots looking up at the sky and the fire escape ladders on apartment buildings, Jalen's images consisted of many objects and materials at his eye level or lower. "Look, garbage," Jalen exclaimed at the sight of the bags. The soda bottles, he noted, were in the store where they stopped to get something to eat. The children's perspectives were closer to the ground, reminding us that who makes images matter. While visual sociologists traditionally have advocated for valid sociological images to be taken from the vantage point of the human eye, this begs the question, whose eyes? Marjorie Oriana maintains that the human eye is positioned at many different heights and its inclinations are shaped by social contexts. And the idea of the social for children is important to probe. Within the children's pictures, the social context involved more than human social engagements. Images of their public excursions also brought up the ways that humans share city sidewalks with dogs, squirrels, and cats that live in the wooded areas of the local city parks. Though New York City is often depicted by adults as a concrete jungle, Kamea, almost 3 years old, zoomed into bushes to show the pokey leaves that she said sometimes prick her. And she even included a photo of where the leaves poked her, she said. Kamea also made 2 images of an Osage orange, a common fruit enjoyed by squirrels and found on park grounds that many of us adults walk by and question but never stop to interact with, or rarely do. One photo she made was a before image with the Osage orange intact. The second was an after image with the orange smashed and smeared across the cement ground. In several photos, Jalen imaged the movement of his feet, sometimes alongside his mother's on the pavement. There he was, walking through the city on his way home. And when I asked him about one of his sidewalk images, Jalen remarked, "That street is taking us to home." His phrasing reminds us that the act of going home for children can involve the active participation of the street. It's not just that children take streets home, but that recognizable streets as part of important routines are also taking them home. Constituting nearly 1/3 of the photographs taken by all 11 children, the children's photos of the city were significant not only in number, but also in how the images set into motion recognitions, recollections, identifications, memories, and imaginings of futures. The children examined images of public spaces carefully in case a street, a train stop, or a place was, quote, theirs. When the photographs were on display, images of the subway trains and platforms provoked conversation wherein some children declared their position within these places. For example, as the children discussed a photograph of a platform, Suri, almost 3 years old, noted, "My mom and dad lived there." After pausing, she added emphatically, "I live there." Though there was no degree of certainty as to whether it was a 7 train or an A train, Suri was certain that the train represented where she and her family were placed. It did not need to be a photograph of a family living room. A subway car was emblematic enough of the city in which the children thought of as a shared home. So while the familiar aesthetics of New York City subway platforms, subway cars, and leash dogs on sidewalks are part of the ways the young children mapped out their city, Sarayu, aged 4.5, made photographs that mapped out her own cultural space within the city. Like Jalen, she documented a transition from her departure, her home in New York City, to her destination, a Diwali festival in New Jersey. Taking along with her My Little Pony, Sarayu imaged the sunset from the back of the car to the Indian restaurant where the family ate, to the confetti-festooned parking lot of the celebration. For Sarayu, the parking lot and the exterior of the South Asian restaurant were embedded within religious and ethnic practices. In early childhood classrooms, we ask children to learn about their neighborhoods through a curriculum that focuses on addresses. For example, children have to memorize their street address, or places that are deemed significant, which are often directed by adults, like stores, libraries, hospitals, playgrounds, and people who are considered quote unquote community helpers. Even when translated into art making, adults' perspectives of neighborhoods still dominate. A site called artprojectsforkids.org, for example, has a project called Draw Your Neighborhood, where children are directed to, quote, draw their neighborhood by creating stacked blocks instead of side-by-side ones. They claim that it lets students focus on just drawing buildings. Rarely are liminal spaces accounted for as significant places to children, though scholars of children's geographies and aesthetic practices have written on children's connections to streets. Trophy-Protz asserts that forms of spatial occupation in the street, including the performance of usual itineraries and social encounters in the neighborhood, is an essential element for the growth of children's social identity, as well as their senses of location and sociability. That is, children's activities in liminal spaces like the street, within subway cars, and in tiny stores within the subway terminal that we don't often think about are where they learn about who they are in relation to the worlds around them. Children's presences within these places are what give place its identity. Though adults attempt to relegate children to bounded areas such as playgrounds, schools, and backyards, children's images assert that they are in and of their localities. I've written previously that public spaces are physically, socially, and affectively organized and reorganized by children's engagements within them. The presence of children impacts networks of relations within city microsystems, neighborhood blocks, bodegas, community gatherings, and public spaces. And children's images can cue us to those relationships. However, the reality is that the social, affective, and material arrangements of city streets, suburban blocks, and shared public spaces are largely determined by adults. Adults understand place in terms of Cartesian maps, departures and destinations, and two-dimensional aerial views. Therefore, it really is of no surprise that typically the first units in early elementary social studies curriculum focus on my community or my neighborhood from adults' perspectives, as though children don't already know their neighborhoods in other ways. So we want to pause for a moment here and engage you in another provocation, given the images that you just saw that the children made of their local spaces. And we want to ask you to just go back into your childhood memories and think about where you spent your time. Just take about 2 minutes to sketch or write out about a place or space from your childhood. This is just a time for you to reflect. We're not going to have time to share on the mic, but you can share it in the chat if you'd like. We just want to give you time to mark the salient sounds, sights, smells, and sensations that you might have experienced as a child in your local places. So we'll take 2 minutes for that. Okay, again, if you'd like to share in the chat, you can certainly do that. But we're going to move on to Vivek's part of the paper.
Using that, we really wonder how can we recall our childhood sense of time and place as a way to re-see the world around us, and how can we train our senses in order to look differently. Tran and I think that children's photos and art as renditions of their entanglements with their local environments can act as a meditation for adults and educators to reframe our conceptions of local spaces. I want to now share stories of mapping with prospective teachers who've been schooled into dominant, that is, adult practices of placemaking. These stories of mapping with pre-service teachers in the Midwestern United States help us to see what we as teachers and teacher educators can possibly do to look beyond our own adult notions of what it is that makes a place. The artist and geographer Catherine Harmon writes that map making fulfills one of our deepest desires, which is understanding the world around us and our place in it. Before the advent of the camera, maps offered pictorial representations of place, guiding travelers, offering a foray into landscapes of other geographies, and capturing our relationships and imaginations of the world around us onto a two-dimensional plane. Maps shape how we engage with, understand, and move through the worlds we inhabit. But maps are also essentially political, shaped by decisions about aesthetics, what to include and what to exclude, what things or beings are worthy of being marked. As adults, most of us have been socialized into thinking about map making and map reading in narrow functional terms, primarily focused on navigation, identification, and occupation. Contemporary maps are colonial constructs. Working with prospective elementary teachers, I invite them to explore map-making practices that we've been taught and are expected to teach in schools. We start by making maps. The instructions that I give them are similar to what we did at the beginning of this talk. A majority of the adults who participate in this activity end up making maps that offer a top-down view of their neighborhood. Most maps have streets that are marked and named, but are devoid of any other beings. I made a similar map when I was first introduced to this activity by Stephen Verla, who's the current curator of humane education at the Detroit Zoo. Stephen uses this to talk about our notion of the environment and the natural world. My students and I realized that most of us are simply reproducing the maps that we see on a day-to-day basis. Google Maps, National Geographic maps, and maps we use to travel. Harmon, again, calls these the use it or lose it variety of maps, and their primary function is to help us to get from point A to point B. Like Tran mentioned, these are the kinds of Cartesian maps that find prominence in schools and are used to teach young children to be map readers. They're presented with an already ordered and structured notion of a place seen from above and rendered through a human, adult-centered notion of usability. This orientation to map making shares similarity with the curricular focus of schools, wherein learning is less about relationality and exploration. Instead, it is a structured endeavor to meet pre-existing and standardized goals. In this ordering, children's desires, explorations, and curiosities about their localities and worlds are quelled and replaced with adult understandings. In an attempt to break open the schism between children's imaginations and schooling, I share with the prospective teachers maps that have been created by children that challenge dominant understandings of map making. Samina Mishra, Sherna Dastoor, and the children of Okla's 2017 book titled My Sweet Home, Childhood Stories from a Corner of the City is a striking example of how children's notion of place is often in stark contrast to adult orientations. Mishra and Dastoor's project began in response to the Bartla House encounter in 2008, when two young people living in that neighborhood of East Delhi were murdered by the police. News channels proclaimed Okla, an industrial suburb of Delhi, to be a terrorist hub, and Mishra and Dastoor wanted to challenge and change the Islamophobic narrative about the place and the community that lives there. The maps, art, stories, and photos in the book, created by 20 children from the neighborhood, tell a starkly different story of Okla than the one circulating in mainstream media. Mishra writes that the children's aesthetic engagement allows us to experience everyday life, in which people went to work and children went to school, in which birthdays were celebrated and kites were flown, in which exams were taken, friendships made and broken, cricket matches played, etc. Sounds pretty similar to your everyday life, doesn't it? The maps in My Sweet Home are a reminder that children's engagement with place brings a more than human understanding of local ecologies. In Amna's map that you see on the screen now, space and time are compressed to offer a foray into all the living and non-living beings that have impacted her. Marked differently from the maps made by adults in my classroom, her map includes fish in a small pond, people walking, fruits on a tree, and a whole range of colors. A generous reader might consider Amna's choices atypical, while others might question its usability as a map. However, these maps are provocations for us to rethink our relationship to space, our surroundings, and how we've been socialized to think about map making. The children in My Sweet Home remind us that as adults, we have to move past our habitual ways of seeing, which are typically developmental and anthropocentric, and be re-invited to a way of seeing, being with, and relating to the vibrancy and pulsations of everyday life. Using the book as a provocation, I invite future elementary educators to embark on their own map-making adventures, to try and unlearn the linear map-making that they've been taught in schools, and they might replicate in their future classrooms. Using photography as a means to reorient their relationship to and understanding of their surroundings, I ask them to play with perspective, which is about the spatial relationship between the photographer and the viewer, and the objects and beings within an image. I ask students to create 10 images of their neighborhood while exploring different perspectives: a bird's eye view, a point of view, an eye level, and a worm's eye view. In order to recreate these images, students along with their cameras are propelled to enter into a varying range of physical and imaginative relations with their surroundings. This seemingly simple perspectival shift results in them seeing and experiencing that place differently and in creating different images of the same place. The prospective teachers explore various beings and materials that are often overlooked by adults. For example, M photographed her neighborhood through the inside of a decaying pumpkin that I assume was left after Halloween. E's point of view photograph of a vending machine marks this techno food device, which is an important part of students' lives and also stands as a reminder of how the food we consume is traversing large distances and is touched by many people before it's dispensed by a machine. J photographs her pet. In another image, we see a bird's eye view of 3 children possibly returning from school and stopping to notice something along the sidewalk. These photographs, akin to the photographs created by the young children in Tran's study, bring attention to the materiality of the places we inhabit. For example, many of us have seen a stray cup or other detritus on the street, but how many of us have noticed it, tried to get close to it, or to photograph it? I invite the prospective teachers to recreate maps of their neighborhoods using these images and the experience of exploring their neighborhoods from a quote-unquote new perspective. We call these maps inspired by children's art. If maps often function to depict places as temporally static, the photographs and the maps created by the prospective teachers are now snapshots of place as well as the human and more than human materials that make it. Take, for example, here, M's map of the textures, materials, and colors in her neighborhood. Each time I do this activity, I learn more about the lives and the places that the prospective teachers inhabit. A's map documents on the bottom left time and space on a single plane, depicting the life of a prospective teacher on a college campus on a single day. M's map traces, using jute, chalk, and circular images, the textures along the river on campus. What becomes amply evident to all of us in the classroom then is that the maps, which have been inspired by children's art, tell their own unique stories of place instead of a predetermined narrative told from above. These examples highlight how decentering the adult gaze with an attention towards children's ways of being in and with their local ecologies can support alternative visions for placemaking. Attending to how cameras can attune us to the more than human elements often on the peripheries of our vision or disregarded as refuse that are part of children's and youth's placemaking, my students and I use children's aesthetic engagements to see, sense, and organize places differently. The image-making practices of children, whether in Tran's study or in the book My Sweet Home, tell us about the experience of being human in connection with others and with the world of nature, and the responsibility to conserve and restore our shared environments for future generations. Most importantly, they challenge developmentalist and anthropocentric models on which much of contemporary social, political, and educational experiences are ordered. In these experiences, the figure of the human is often imagined as an adult, and nature is abstracted to the macro, green pastures, tall mountains, oceans, and animals in the wild, rather than the micro worlds and micro ecosystems that surround us all the time. Look, there's a moth flying around there. There's a blade of grass that is growing from a crinkle in the concrete. In My Sweet Home, Amna notes that her grandmother's home is also about the trees that surround it. I really like going to my grandmother's house because there's a guava tree, she writes. Within and across these examples, children are attending to their local ecologies and making meaning through interactions with materials, people, and other beings. The photographs of children and prospective teachers in our work invite us to acknowledge how human lives are dependent on and relate to multi-species and the more than human. In many ways, urban lives have been constructed to push these considerations to the periphery, or at least to conceal them. Careful not to overdetermine children's and prospective teachers' photographs, we treat the objects across these photographs as provocations actually for further inquiry. For example, pictures of garbage and recycling bags made by 3-year-old Jaylin, along with the images of decaying pumpkins made by prospective teachers, invite us to think with scholars such as Numalo and Rubin, who have written on the need to examine and question our relationships to waste, including a need for investigating waste legacies and responding to waste impact on more than human life. These images are markers of observations and noticing that our respective participants, irrespective of their age, embarked on and are situated within the more than human play stories that perhaps are less innocent than we think. It is a reminder to me, to Tran, and hopefully to our students that if we as adults pause our obsessions with teaching young children the adult ways of seeing and being in the world, a whole range of understandings, relationships, and possibilities emerge.
In using visual methods to inquire into children's sense of place, we have to acknowledge the ocular-centric nature of this work, not to mention within dominant practices of placemaking and map making. While we're both drawn to the possibilities of image-making practices, we are aware of its ableist assumptions, as we're reminded by Wargo, Brownell, and Oliveira, and that approaches that center on other senses, movement, touch, smell, hearing, and multimodal frameworks can also attune us to placemaking in diverse ways, such as in the work of Abby Hackett and Jay Thiel. For example, Wargo, Brownell, and Oliveira tell 3 stories of how an engagement with the sonic resonances of children's everyday lives can offer us distinct ways of understanding and knowing the world. This is in a 2021 article that they've recently put out. They also challenge us to consider that our habits of placemaking are embedded within particular sensibilities, for them sonic, for us visual, that may require re-educating. In fact, we have to acknowledge that the places we write about in this piece and are currently speaking from are part of stolen and unceded territories of various indigenous nations located in the Midwestern, Northeastern, and Southern parts of what is known by settlers as the United States. We understand that places are shaped by the more than human bodies, and histories and stories of the place. And considering this can, quote, unsettle an innocent framing of the stories of children's, artists, and teachers' photographs and maps of our work, maps within our work. While we cannot make easy claims about children's and teachers' motivations behind photographs of materials within their local geographies, they do bring attention to alternative ways of understanding our relation to place and placemaking practices. Indigenous scholars remind us that places are storied, shifting over time and space and through interactions with flows of people, other species, social practices, write Tuck and Mackenzie. In contrast to the linear, static, and settler colonial practices and histories taught in schools, children's image-making practices invite us to think about the storied nature of place and the entanglements of matter and lives.
As adults and educators, we might have the impulse to write off the images children make as being unremarkable or useless. However, to borrow from Donna Haraway, if we stay with the trouble and question our own preconceived notions and curricular narratives about place, these images hold the potential to animate important conversations about how we think about place, placemaking, and maps in our curriculum and educational practice. We would like to end this talk with another provocation and an invitation for you to make. Based on some of the photographs, maps, and ideas that we've shared, how would you map your neighborhoods differently? How might you create maps that decenter the adult gaze and are instead maps inspired by children's art? We invite you to create these maps using photography, collage, or any other medium that you would like to. With the collaboration of Drs. Chris Schulte and Dr. Hayon Park, we'd love to have your work on the Center for Study of Childhood Arts website so that we can share with one another how our perspective of place shifts when we use children's art as a provocation. Tran will now share a link to a Google form you can use to submit images of your maps earlier from today if you would like to, and the ones you might create later on. We ask that you do this by Monday, September 27th, which is a week from today. Also, with the support of the center, we have 3 copies each of the 2 books that you see here on the screen, one of them being Samina Mishra's book and another book about photography. And CSCA will choose 6 individuals randomly, and we'll ship these copies to you. Thank you all once again, and we look forward to your questions, comments, and maps, and are appreciative of CSCA for creating this opportunity for us to share our work. Thank you all.
Thank you, Tran and Vivek. We very much appreciated your presentation this evening and opportunity to learn more about your work. So we have about 10 minutes remaining for questions. So if you have any questions, please put it in the chat. We have one question in the Q&A box. Tran and Vivek, I don't know if you can see this, but I can read Mohit's question. So given the ocular visual focus of your work right now, I wonder if 2 of you are experimenting with placemaking through other sensorial or multimodal means with children and or teachers. Thanks for shifting my frame and thinking. So yeah.
Vivek, do you want to answer that? I think writing this piece, and especially the piece of the part that we just read, I think does compel us to work towards that. And I'm coming into this thinking about this more as I teach a course in early childhood where I spend a lot of time showing videos and we spend a lot of time observing visually. And one of our students has vision impairment, right? So it's forcing me, I mean, it's not, it shouldn't force me, but it's compelling me to think more about that. And we're very fortunate to have good friends and colleagues in John Wargo and Cassie Brownell who have been doing this. So, and I know they're in the audience right now, or I think they were before. So I think we really want to look to them to guide us in that.
There are a couple other questions in the chat window. So I can read Mila's question first. So besides photography, do you also consider children's drawings as placemaking?
Tran, I saw you mute yourself. Absolutely, and I think My Sweet Home is a great example of that work. I know Tran didn't share it here in this presentation, but the way we came to this paper was also looking at, was it a drawing, Tran, or a sketch that one of your young participants made of the subway network of New
Yeah, I
York?
meant to include that in this too, right? Yeah, we were looking at, we had a 3-year-old who was quite interested in, and as 3-year-olds typically are in New York City, right, who are taking the subways every day. So who was quite interested in map making and wanted to look at maps, but also creating his own maps through drawing. And he's still drawing today. Not sure if I haven't seen maps recently, but I'm sure they're maps in their own ways. I think taken together, they're actually a map of his, in a way, of his childhood. But yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'll read Rachel's question. I'm wondering about the sharing of children's placemaking through art and photography with the community and what interruptions it might present to the community at large. Have you experienced this in any of your work?
I'm just thinking about your work with, because you do a lot of community work with youth and intergenerational work too. I feel like there's
Yeah. And I think as part of this talk, which is also why we're asking you all, inviting you all to share some of your maps, is some kind of pipe dream for both Tran and I, is to shift what the materials that are present in school spaces, right? Like I often dream and imagine a collection of maps that are made by young people that are in libraries in the form of zines or drawings on the wall, what that might look like, how might it shift our understandings of maps. And again, to reiterate the point that a lot of this work is building off the work of other scholars who've done this. There's a lot of amazing work on community-based mapping, audio, spatial, visual, that is also inspiring. And we'd love for this to be in community spaces, but also in schools, like really, even just in a school of education. I'd love to see the walls being filled with young people's art of that place. So that's a pipe dream for sure.
Great. Thank you, Vivek. Yeah, we have Melita's question here. How do you support teachers' reflection on their creations? What are some of the shifts they articulate around their understanding of geography or place? Do conversations move naturally toward discussions of socio-political context of space?
Thanks, Melita. I think the challenge, and again, both Tran and I are wrestling with this in the paper too, is that while we share some of these provocations with the teachers, it's not necessarily always taken up. And we notice that even when you see the photographs that the teachers create, prospective teachers create versus what the young people create, even though they bring a slightly fresh perspective, they're still very neatly framed, very neatly organized. Some of that stuff is going to take time to unlearn, including for myself. So for some folks, the conversation moves a little bit. For some people, it moves a lot. But one clear, stark thing that happens is from that initial provocation where we see each other's maps and they look very similar, to making these maps which are inspired by children's art. You see that if there's 25 prospective teachers, 22 look different from each other. So even just them being able to see each other's maps that look remarkably different of a similar locality or a big enough neighborhood is an interesting reflection. And then we have conversations about people focusing on textures, sounds, smells, their life and other things like that. Sometimes it works, sometimes it does. I don't want to make it sound like it magically changes everything.
If
Yeah,
there are
there's
no,
one comment.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
So if there's no additional questions, we'll go ahead and close out this evening's talk. Dr. Templeton and Dr. Vellanki. Oh. Dr. Templeton and Dr. Vellanki, thank you for taking the time to be with us this evening and for sharing your work. For those of you who took time out of your busy schedules, both personal and professional, to join us, thank you. We appreciate your support and hope you found this evening's presentation to be as inspiring as we did. As a final reminder, to learn more about our work and current initiatives, please take some time to visit our website at www.centerforthestudyofchildhoodart.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at CSCA_ChildArt and on Instagram at UARC_Center for Child Art. Also, stay tuned for additional information about our next speaker for the Childhood Art Speaker Series, Dr. Mona Sacher of Middlesex University in London. Again, thank you, Dr. Templeton and Dr. Vellanki, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all.